The grand marble columns of the federal courthouse of Washington, D.C. loomed overhead like silent witnesses to history. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the kind that clings to the walls during trials that decide the fate of nations. Donald J. Trump, former president and now the most controversial defendant in modern American history, sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. Across from him, on the judge's bench, sat Nathaniel Hargrove, the man determined to see him in prison. The courtroom was a circus. Journalists scribbled feverishly, cameras snapped every slight movement, and rows of political operatives sat in the audience, some whispering in hushed tones, others waiting for the kill. Trump knew what they wanted. The perp walk. The mugshot. The humiliation of the century. But what they didn't know, what Judge Hargrove didn't know, was that this trial would end in a way none of them expected. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he prepared to speak. Mr. Trump, your legal team's latest motion to dismiss is... The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open with a loud bang. A man in a crisp navy suit entered, his movements swift, purposeful. He carried a slim black folder, which he clutched like a loaded weapon. The room fell silent. The figure was Mark Hastings, director of the FBI. Judge Hargrove's voice faltered. This wasn't part of the script. The prosecutor, sweating under the bright overhead lights, turned pale. Hastings didn't even spare him a glance as he made his way toward the prosecution's table and slid the folder across the polished wood. "Your Honor," Hastings said, his voice smooth but firm, "I need to request an immediate recess." Hargrove gripped the gavel, his fingers tightening. "This is highly unusual, Director Hastings." Hastings nodded, unbothered. "I believe the contents of that file will explain the urgency." The judge hesitated, then opened the folder. His face drained of color. Inside were bank records, wire transfers, evidence of offshore accounts under shell corporations traced back to him, photographs, grainy but clear, showing him in a dimly lit parking garage, exchanging an envelope stuffed with cash with a known political operative. A bribe. The room, still unaware of what was unfolding, buzzed with murmurs. Hargrove tried to keep his composure, but the hand that held the folder trembled. Trump leaned back in his chair, watching with amusement. He didn't need to say a word. Hargrove snapped the folder shut, pushing it aside as if the documents inside were radioactive. His mouth opened, but no words came. Hastings stepped closer. His voice dropped to a whisper, but in the dead-silent room, it may as well have been shouted. "We have enough evidence to charge you with obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and bribery." Hastings's lips barely moved. "We can do this quietly, or we can do it the way you plan to do it to Trump." Hargrove's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Sweat pooled at his collar. If he called a mistrial now, he'd be admitting guilt. If he tried to dismiss the case, the media would tear him apart. His own allies would abandon him. He was trapped. Then, Hastings delivered the final blow. "Marshals are waiting outside." The judge swallowed hard. His grip on the gavel was so tight his knuckles turned white. He turned toward Trump. The former president sat completely still, his eyes locked onto the judge's in silent triumph. Trump gave him a slow, knowing nod. Hargrove's fate was sealed. He could feel the walls closing in. The judge exhaled shakily. He picked up his gavel, but instead of the confident slam that had punctuated his rulings, the sound that followed was weak, uncertain. "The court is in recess," Hargrove muttered. He stood on unsteady legs, his face ashen as he stepped down from the bench. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Reporters surged forward, demanding answers. Spectators whispered, their eyes darting between Hargrove and Trump. The judge ignored them all, moving quickly toward the doors, toward the inevitable. Just before he reached them, 2 U.S. Marshals stepped inside. Hargrove stopped dead. His breath hitched as they took a step forward. One of them reached for his handcuffs. The judge's mouth opened, maybe to protest, maybe to beg. But before he could say anything, the cold snap of metal around his wrists silenced him. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. Shouts. Reporters scrambling to capture every angle of the man who had tried to bring down Trump, now in chains. Trump sat back, adjusting his tie, watching it all unfold. And then, in the chaos, A single phrase left his lips. Soft, but unmistakable. The walls of the federal courthouse of Washington, D.C. seemed to pulse with electricity as the shock of Judge Hargrove's arrest rippled through the courtroom. The man who had spent months orchestrating Trump's downfall now stood in the very place he had intended to see the former president convicted, hands bound in cold steel. The media exploded. Reporters scrambled over each other, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward anyone who looked remotely willing to comment. Gasps and murmurs filled the packed chamber as the reality of the moment set in. Trump had won. From his seat at the defense table, Donald J. Trump leaned back, adjusting the cuff of his navy blue suit. He didn't smile, not yet. The real moment of satisfaction would come later. For now, he simply watched as Hargrove, the so-called beacon of justice, was escorted toward the courtroom exit by 2 U.S. Marshals. It was over. Or so they thought. Because just as the judge neared the towering oak doors, the prosecutor, Evan Moore, stood up. "Wait!" he barked, his voice slicing through the chaos. The room froze. Moore, a lifelong adversary of Trump, had spent his entire career positioning himself as the man who would take the former president down. He wasn't going to let it slip away so easily. "Your Honor," he said, then hesitated, realizing that Hargrove was no longer Your Honor. He pivoted to the backup judge, hastily stepping in, Judge Raymond Keaton, a man Trump's legal team had not expected. "I request an immediate continuation of this trial," Moore said, his voice tight with desperation. "We cannot allow one individual's misconduct to derail the entire process. This case must proceed." The crowd erupted again. Trump raised an eyebrow. "This guy doesn't quit," he muttered under his breath. At the bench, Judge Keaton frowned. He was a wild card, a moderate, one not easily swayed by political theatrics. His eyes scanned the courtroom, calculating. The legal circus had already gone off the rails, and now he had to decide whether to press forward or shut it all down. Trump's lead attorney, Nathan Coleman, stood. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the very foundation of this case has been compromised." Judge Hargrove was not just overseeing the trial, he was manipulating it. Bribery, corruption, how can we trust a single ruling he made? Moore slammed his palm on the prosecution's table. "That's irrelevant. The evidence against the defendant remains. We cannot let one bad actor." A loud cough interrupted him. From Trump. All eyes turned. The former president slowly rose from his seat, adjusting the button of his jacket. He tilted his head slightly, the way he always did before delivering one of his infamous rhetorical knockout punches. "I gotta say," he began, voice casual, almost amused, "this is one of the most pathetic things I've ever seen. And believe me, I've seen a lot." Murmurs spread through the audience. Even Judge Keaton leaned forward slightly. "Let's just get this straight," Trump continued. "Your star judge, the guy who was supposed to make sure this thing was fair, was caught. What was it again?" He turned to the FBI director, Mark Hastings, who was still seated nearby. Hastings barely glanced up. "Bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice." Trump nodded dramatically. Right. Bribery, conspiracy, obstruction. Sounds really bad." A chuckle rippled through the gallery. Moore's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, I object to this." Trump raised a hand. "And now you're saying the trial should go on anyway?" He let the words hang in the air. "After we just found out the entire thing was rigged from the start?" More murmurs. Trump exhaled, shaking his head. "You know, this reminds me of that time I walked into a casino and the dealer was working with the house. Total scam. You know what I did? I walked out." He leaned forward slightly. "Because I don't play rigged games." The audience stirred, some nodding, some muttering. Even a few journalists, normally hostile, seemed reluctantly intrigued. Judge Keaton tapped his gavel twice. "Enough. We need to determine whether this trial can proceed under these circumstances." Moore pounced. "Your Honor, the justice system does not bend to one corrupt official. The evidence is what matters. And we have the evidence." Judge Keaton frowned. Then, he turned to Director Hastings. "Director, I assume your investigation into Judge Hargrove is ongoing?" Hastings nodded. "It is." Keaton folded his hands. Then tell me, was there any indication that the judge's misconduct extended to the evidence itself? Hastings hesitated. We are still determining the full extent of his actions. The response was carefully worded, but it was enough. Keaton exhaled. In that case, the only responsible course of action is to suspend these proceedings until the integrity of the evidence can be verified. The courtroom exploded. Moore's face went red. This is a stalling tactic, he shouted. Keaton slammed the gavel down. Enough. The court is in recess until further notice. Case adjourned. With that, the sound of the gavel's final crack echoed through the chamber. Moore sank back in his chair, defeated. It was over. Trump smirked. He turned to Coleman and clapped a hand on his shoulder. Not bad, huh? Coleman exhaled. You just dismantled their entire case with a casino story. Trump grinned. It's what I do. As he stood to leave, the media swarmed him, shouting questions. Mr. Trump, do you believe this case will be thrown out completely? President Trump, what's your next move? He stopped at the door, adjusting his tie. Then, with his signature half-smirk, he delivered the headline they'd be running for days. I told you, it was a witch hunt. And guess what? The witch just got burned. With that, he walked out, leaving the shattered remains of his enemies behind him. But he wasn't done yet. Judge Raymond Keaton took his seat, tapping the gavel once. The courtroom was full. Reporters filled every available inch, their cameras primed to capture what was already being called the most explosive legal showdown in modern history. On one side, the prosecution, now led solely by Evan Moore, the desperate federal attorney who had staked his entire career on bringing Trump down. On the other side, Trump, unshaken, unbothered, and ready for war. Moore cleared his throat, stepping forward. Your Honor, the defense has called for an emergency hearing regarding the prosecution's conduct. He forced a smirk. Frankly, this is just another attempt by Mr. Trump to play the victim. Trump raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Not yet. Judge Keaton adjusted his glasses. Mr. Coleman, you may proceed. Trump's lead attorney, Nathan Coleman, stood, flipping open a thick folder and placing it on the table. He didn't bother looking at Moore. Your Honor, the entire case against President Trump was built on evidence that has now been compromised. Moore scoffed. That's ridiculous. Coleman didn't flinch. Instead, he picked up a single sheet of paper and handed it to the bailiff. Your Honor, I present into evidence a document recovered by the FBI this morning. A document that was buried in Judge Hargrove's personal email archives. Judge Keaton took the paper, his eyes scanning it carefully. Silence. Then, his expression darkened. What exactly am I looking at, Mr. Coleman? Coleman clasped his hands behind his back. That is a draft ruling. Written 2 weeks ago. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Moore shifted uncomfortably. So what? Coleman's eyes flashed. This ruling, written and saved before the trial even started, declares Trump guilty on all charges. Gasps. Moore's face paled. Coleman wasn't done. Hargrove had already planned the conviction. This was never a real trial. It was a setup. The room exploded. Journalists whispered, furiously scribbling notes. Some even started texting editors mid-hearing. Judge Keaton's jaw tightened. Director Hastings, he said, turning to the FBI chief, can you confirm this document's authenticity? Hastings nodded grimly. Our forensic analysts verified the metadata. The file was created 2 weeks ago and never altered. The courtroom erupted again. Trump just sat there, tapping his fingers on the defense table. Moore shot up. This is absurd. He was sweating now. Even if that document is real, it doesn't change the evidence against Mr. Trump. Coleman cut him off. Which brings us to our next point. Another document was handed to the bailiff. Judge Keaton's brow furrowed. What is this? Coleman smiled. That, Your Honor, is a memo. Written by Evan Moore himself. Moore froze. Coleman continued, voice smooth as silk. This memo, dated 3 months ago, directs DOJ investigators to suppress evidence that could exonerate my client. Silence. Then, chaos. Moore's face twisted in horror. "That's a lie," he shouted. Coleman ignored him. The memo was retrieved from a government server. It specifically instructs officials to bury testimony that contradicts the prosecution's narrative. Judge Keaton's gaze locked onto Moore. "Mr. Moore, is this true?" Moore's lips quivered. "Your Honor, this—" Keaton's voice turned cold. "Did you order the suppression of evidence?" Moore collapsed into his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Trump, finally, smirked. The prosecution had been caught. Judge Keaton took a long, slow breath. Then, in a voice that would be replayed on every news channel for weeks, he spoke. "This trial is over." The courtroom erupted. Shouts, gasps, screams from journalists trying to get the scoop out first. Moore looked like he had seen a ghost. Keaton lifted the gavel. "The case against Donald J. Trump is dismissed." Slam. The sound of the gavel was like a gunshot. The political world detonated. Reporters rushed for the exits, their phones pressed against their ears, delivering the breaking news of the century. Moore just sat there, staring into nothing. His career was over. He would be lucky if he wasn't prosecuted himself. Trump stood slowly, exhaling as if he had just finished a round of golf. He adjusted his tie and looked across the room, to the same cameras that had dreamed of capturing his downfall. Instead, they had captured his victory. He stepped toward the exit, his security detail clearing the way. But just before leaving, he turned to Moore, his voice dripping with amusement. "You guys never learn." Then, with the eyes of the world on him, Donald J. Trump walked out of the courthouse a free man. The federal courthouse of Washington, D.C. had never seen such chaos. Judge Keaton's final gavel strike had declared Donald J. Trump a free man. The trial was over, the case against him destroyed, and the very people who had tried to take him down were now the ones facing serious legal trouble. Outside, the scene was pure pandemonium. Hundreds of cameras flashed. Journalists screamed questions, their voices colliding into a deafening roar. Protesters on both sides shouted, some waving Trump 2024 banners, others shrieking for justice. And in the middle of it all, Donald J. Trump, smiling, untouchable. He adjusted his tie as he descended the courthouse steps, flanked by Secret Service agents who barely contained the swarming mob of reporters. One journalist shoved a microphone toward him. "Mr. Trump, do you believe this proves the case was politically motivated?" Trump chuckled. "Oh, no question about it. This was a witch hunt from day one." Another reporter jumped in. "What happens next?" Trump paused. Then, with his signature smirk, he leaned toward the mic. "Well," he said, grinning, "I think it's time we start asking, who's really going to jail?" 1 week later, back in the courthouse. The scene was eerily familiar. Same packed courtroom. Same tense silence. Same rows of flashing cameras. But this time, Donald J. Trump wasn't the defendant. He was sitting in the front row, watching as the man who had once tried to put him away for life now sat in his place. Evan Moore, the lead prosecutor who had spent years plotting Trump's downfall, now sat at the defense table, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His face pale, his jaw tight, his career, and possibly his freedom, on the verge of total collapse. The charges against him: obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, conspiracy to commit fraud. A list of crimes longer than a Biden speech. And at the bench, Judge Raymond Keaton. No longer a man who had to consider politics. No longer afraid of the DOJ. He had seen the truth, and now justice was being served. Keaton cleared his throat. "Mr. Moore, do you understand the charges against you?" Moore's lawyer nudged him, whispering something frantically. Moore swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor." Keaton nodded. "And how do you plead?" Moore hesitated. The weight of the room pressed down on him. He could fight, but he had nothing left. "Guilty," he muttered. A wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. Trump. He just sat back, arms crossed, watching it all fall apart. Keaton nodded once. "Then this court will proceed with sentencing." Moore lowered his head. His life was over. Trump leaned over to his attorney, Nathan Coleman, and whispered, "Beautiful, isn't it?" Coleman smirked. "Poetic justice." Trump let out a satisfied exhale. Damn right. The Oval Office had never felt more like home. Trump stood behind the resolute desk, gazing out the window at the Washington Monument. The headlines were everywhere. Trump destroys rigged trial. Prosecutor pleads guilty in humiliating twist. Will Trump run again? The whole world had watched. And now the path was clear. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You really did it, sir." Trump turned. It was John McAllister, his most trusted advisor. Trump smiled. "Oh, we're just getting started, John." McAllister raised an eyebrow. "What's next?" Trump grinned. Then he walked over to the resolute desk, sat down, and grabbed a pen. He picked up a single sheet of paper. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Trump 2028 Campaign Plan." He signed it. Then, looking up, he smirked. "Now," he said, leaning back, "let's make America great again."